A billionaire father thought his money could give his disabled son everything until he saw a poor waitress let the boy climb into her lap. And what happened after that changed their lives in a way he never expected. The diner was small, with checkered floors and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. The billionaire stepped inside with his young son, moving quietly to a booth in the corner. He was a man everyone in the city knew by name, though here he was just another customer. His son, a boy of around 8 years old, sat close to him, fidgeting with the strap of his bag. The boy's disability made it hard for him to move like other children, and people often stared. The father had grown used to those stares, but he still hated them. He wanted this to be a simple meal, nothing more. The waitress walked over with a notepad in her hand, her smile bright and natural. She didn't glance awkwardly at the boy, didn't hesitate the way so many others did. She leaned down, looked directly at him, and asked what he would like to eat. The boy blinked, surprised, and glanced at his father. Usually, people asked the father instead of him, as if he couldn't speak for himself. But this time, someone was talking to him. His lips curved into a small smile, and in a shy voice he whispered his order. The father sat back watching. He wasn't used to this. Strangers often avoided his son, or treated him like glass. But this waitress didn't. She nodded, wrote down his words, and even teased him lightly about adding dessert. The boy laughed, a sound the father rarely heard in public. Something stirred inside him, though he said nothing. He simply studied the woman's easy manner, the way she made his son feel comfortable without trying too hard. When the food came, the boy struggled a little with the fork. Usually, the father would help, but before he could move, the waitress bent down and quietly asked the boy if he wanted her to cut the pancakes for him. He nodded eagerly. She did it gently, placing the fork back into his small hands as if it were the most normal thing in the world. She didn't rush. She didn't act as though it were a burden. She simply helped, then stood again, and went on to the next table with the same warm smile. The boy's eyes followed her as she worked. Watching how she carried plates, poured coffee, and spoke to customers, she seemed to fill the diner with light, even though her apron was a little worn and her hair was tied back loosely. To him, she looked like someone who belonged in every place he wanted to be. As the meal went on, the boy's shyness faded. When she came back to check on them, he asked her small questions. How many tables she had, whether she got tired walking so much, what her favorite food on the menu was. She answered every question with patience, bending down so she could look him in the eyes. To her, he wasn't just a child in a wheelchair. He was a boy who wanted to talk, who deserved to be heard. The father found himself silent. He was used to boardrooms, investors, headlines with his name on them. He was used to people nodding quickly, doing whatever he asked, speaking to him with careful respect. But none of that mattered here. His son was laughing softly, asking questions, eating more than he usually did, and it was all because of this waitress. She had managed in minutes what he often struggled to do at home, make his son feel free. When the plates were cleared, the boy tugged at his father's sleeve. His eyes were wide and he pointed toward the waitress who was pouring coffee at the counter. The father leaned close to hear what he whispered. The boy wanted to sit with her. He wanted to be near her, as if something about her warmth was pulling him closer. The father hesitated. He didn't want to embarrass him, and he didn't know how the waitress would react. But the boy's wish was clear. The next time she came to the table, the boy looked up at her with his shy smile and asked, almost in a whisper, if he could sit with her. For a moment, the father thought she might laugh it off, or gently refuse. But she didn't. She crouched down so they were face to face and asked softly if he really wanted to. When he nodded, she carefully lifted him into her lap, settling him there with ease, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The diner kept buzzing around them, dishes clinking, doors swinging, conversations flowing, but for the father, time seemed to stop. His son leaned into her, resting against her shoulder, content in a way the father had rarely seen. She balanced him effortlessly, still pouring coffee for another table with one hand and chatting with a customer at the counter. She treated him not like a burden, not like a fragile thing, but like a child who belonged. The billionaire's throat tightened as he watched. His whole life, he had been chasing numbers, deals, and recognition. Yet here, in this modest diner, a waitress had done something he could never buy. She had given his son a moment of simple happiness, a moment where he wasn't different or out of place. He was just a boy sitting in the lap of someone who cared. He sipped his coffee slowly, his eyes on them, wondering how someone who worked long hours on her feet could carry so much light inside her. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know her story. But he knew one thing. This ordinary evening was already becoming extraordinary. Something inside him shifted as he sat in that booth. Though he couldn't explain it, he knew that nothing between him, his son, and this kind waitress would ever feel ordinary again. The next morning, the billionaire sat at his office desk, but his mind was far from the tall windows and endless city skyline in front of him. He was supposed to be preparing for an important call with overseas investors, yet he found himself staring at the memory of his son curled up in the waitress's lap. It wasn't the kind of image that faded quickly. The boy's laughter still echoed in his ears, soft but so alive. He tapped his pen against the desk, restless. That evening, instead of heading to his usual five-star restaurant or having dinner brought to his home, he asked his driver to take him back to the small diner. His son sat beside him in the car, already smiling as though he knew where they were going. When they arrived, the boy's eyes lit up the moment he spotted the waitress. She was behind the counter, balancing 2 plates in one hand and refilling a coffee cup with the other. The father noticed how her smile reached every customer. Not just them, but somehow it felt warmer when it reached his table. This time, the boy wasn't as shy. He waved to her, and she hurried over as soon as she could, bending down to greet him as though they were old friends. The billionaire sat back, watching again, as his son chatted freely. The boy asked her about the milkshakes, about whether she liked chocolate or strawberry better, and laughed when she said she secretly mixed both flavors together when no one was watching. The father couldn't help but chuckle. His son had never been so talkative in public before. The meals became a routine. At first, the billionaire thought it would be just once more, then maybe twice. But soon he found himself driving across town almost every evening. It wasn't about the pancakes or the coffee. It was about the way his son's face glowed when the waitress appeared. The way she seemed to understand him without needing long explanations. Each visit, she found small ways to teach the boy little tricks, how to steady his cup so it wouldn't spill, how to use a napkin to keep food from slipping, even how to stretch his arms in small ways that made moving easier. She never acted like a teacher, yet somehow every encounter felt like a gentle lesson. The father noticed things he had overlooked before. His son's confidence grew. At home, he began trying to do more by himself, buttoning his shirt, holding his fork longer without giving up. The father asked him one night where he learned such determination. The boy's answer was simple. She told me I can. The father lay awake that night, realizing how powerful those words had been. One evening, after closing a large business deal, the billionaire took his son to celebrate at the diner instead of a fancy restaurant. The waitress greeted them with her usual warmth. She brought a slice of pie with a candle for the boy, even though it wasn't his birthday. "Every win deserves pie," she told him with a wink. The boy clapped his hands in delight, and the father felt something shift in his chest. He had celebrated countless victories in his career with champagne and applause. Yet none of them had felt as pure as watching his son blow out that candle. As the days went by, the father began asking the waitress more about her life. At first she brushed it off, answering briefly before hurrying to another table. But he was persistent in a gentle way, genuinely curious. She finally admitted she was working double shifts, sometimes even overnight jobs, just to pay her bills. She lived in a small apartment a few blocks away and had no family nearby. Her days were long, her pay small, yet she spoke of it with no bitterness. She carried herself with quiet strength, as though kindness was enough to fuel her through exhaustion. The billionaire listened, puzzled by the contrast. He was a man surrounded by wealth, luxury cars, and homes bigger than she could imagine, yet he had never seen someone so rich in spirit. He found himself reflecting more and more on the emptiness of his own world. People in his circle measured worth by bank accounts and power. She measured it by laughter, by the joy of a child who wasn't even hers. One night, after the diner had closed, the father lingered in the parking lot with his son. The waitress was locking the door, her apron folded neatly under her arm. The boy called out her name and asked if she could join them for ice cream. She hesitated, glancing at the clock, but then saw the boy's hopeful eyes and agreed. They walked together down the street to a small ice cream stand. For the first time, the billionaire saw her without the apron, without the rush of tables and orders. She looked tired, but free, her laugh softer, more personal. She held the boy's spoon steady as he tried a new flavor, and the billionaire couldn't take his eyes off the scene. It felt almost like a family outing. He began noticing changes in himself, too. The long hours at the office didn't hold the same pull they once did. He started leaving earlier, sometimes skipping meetings, something he had never dared before. His assistants were confused, but he didn't care. Every moment he spent at the diner felt more important than any contract or stock price. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but his son's happiness had become his own priority. And the waitress was at the heart of that happiness. The whispers started slowly. A business partner made a comment about seeing him at a diner beneath his status. Another mentioned the waitress, their tone curious and faintly mocking. The billionaire ignored them, though he felt the weight of their judgment. Yet when he saw his son laughing, eating pie, or telling stories at the diner, none of it mattered. What did the opinions of men in suits mean compared to the light in his son's eyes? The bond grew beyond the walls of the diner. On weekends, the waitress sometimes joined them at the park. She pushed the boy's wheelchair across the grass, cheering him on when he tried to move a little further on his own. She encouraged him to feed ducks at the pond, clapping when he managed to throw crumbs into the water. She treated every small achievement like a victory, and the father realized how often he had overlooked those little steps. He had been so focused on what his son couldn't do that he rarely celebrated what he could. For the boy, she was more than a friend. She became the person he wanted to share every story with, the one he wanted to show his drawings to, the one he asked for whenever he woke up from a bad dream. For the billionaire, this was both beautiful and humbling. A woman who had nothing compared to him had given his son everything he needed: hope, courage, and love that didn't ask for anything in return. The father began to wonder how long he could keep, living two lives, one in the shiny towers of wealth, the other in the small diner filled with laughter. He wasn't ready to answer that question yet, but deep inside, he knew the choice would come one day. And when it did, it wouldn't be money or business that guided him. It would be the image of his son in that waitress's lap, smiling as if the world had finally made room for him. It was a quiet evening when everything began to change. The billionaire had taken his son to the diner again, just like so many nights before. The boy was in high spirits, telling the waitress about a drawing he had made at home. She bent down to look at the paper he had brought along, nodding with pride as though it belonged in an art gallery. The father sipped his coffee, watching the easy flow of affection between them. But that night, something happened outside the diner that neither of them expected. When they left after dinner, the boy asked if they could stop by the park across the street. It wasn't far, and though the air was a little chilly, the father agreed. They wheeled him toward the park, the waitress walking with them. Her steps light despite the long shift she had just finished. The boy wanted to see the fountain lit up at night. They reached the park, and he smiled at the glowing water. For a moment, everything felt perfect. Then a group of older kids walked by. They weren't much older than teenagers, but their careless laughter carried a sharp edge. One of them glanced at the boy in the wheelchair and whispered something to his friends. The others chuckled, and before long, they started making jokes loud enough for the father and waitress to hear. The boy froze. He had heard such comments before, but they always hurt. His hands trembled on the armrest, his head dropping low as though he wanted to disappear. The father's jaw tightened. He was ready to step forward to put an end to it, but before he could move, the waitress crouched beside the boy. She placed her hand gently over his and whispered, "Don't listen to them. They don't know how strong you are." The boy looked up at her, his eyes wet with tears, but her calm face gave him courage. When one of the teens threw another cruel word, she stood up and faced them. Her voice was firm but steady as she told them to leave. Something in her tone made even the boldest one hesitate. They muttered and walked off, their laughter fading into the night. The father stood frozen, He had expected to be the one protecting his son, yet the waitress had been faster, stronger in that moment. She knelt back down and wiped the tears from the boy's cheeks. "You're not what they say," she told him softly. "You're so much more. You're brave, you're kind, and you're my friend." The boy sniffled and managed a small smile. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. And for the first time that evening, his laughter returned. Later, when the boy had settled again, the father found himself unable to stay silent. As they walked the waitress back toward the diner, he asked her how she always knew the right words to say. How could she be so gentle yet so strong in moments that even shook him? At first she hesitated, glancing away as though she wasn't sure if she should share. But then she sighed and spoke softly, almost like someone opening a door they had kept locked for a long time. She told him about her younger brother. He had been born with a disability, not unlike his son's. She had grown up helping him, defending him, guiding him through a world that wasn't always kind. She knew the way people stared, the way cruel words could cut deeper than any wound. For years, her brother had been her closest companion. They had laughed together, shared secrets, and leaned on each other. But then, when she was still young, tragedy struck. A sudden accident had taken her brother's life. She paused as she spoke, her voice breaking slightly. The pain had never fully left her. The billionaire felt a chill run through him. He had never imagined her kindness came from such a deep place of loss. She explained that helping his son, seeing his smile, and making him laugh reminded her of the bond she had once shared with her brother. "It feels like keeping a piece of him alive," she said quietly. Her eyes glistened, but her smile remained steady. "I can't change what happened to him, but maybe I can make life a little easier for someone else." The father was silent for a long moment. He looked at her, really looked, and saw more than just a waitress. He saw a woman who carried pain yet turned it into love. He saw strength built not from wealth or power, but from heartbreak and resilience. His throat tightened as he thought of his own son. He had poured money into doctors, therapies, and special equipment. But he had never given what she gave so free of understanding, his son. Sitting in his chair between them, reached for her hand and held it tightly. "I wish I had met your brother," he said softly. The waitress smiled through her tears and whispered, "I think he would have liked you very much." That night, after the waitress went home, the billionaire sat awake in his study long after his son had gone to bed. He replayed her words in his mind. He thought of the way she had stood up to those teenagers, the way she had spoken about her brother with both grief and love. He thought of his own life, how distant he had been from his son at times, how he had hidden behind his work. He wondered if his wealth had blinded him to the simplest truths. That connection and compassion were worth more than any fortune. The next day he canceled meetings without hesitation. Instead, he took his son to the diner again. But this time, it wasn't just for food. It was because he wanted to see her, to understand more of the world she carried inside her. He asked her about her brother again, and she told him stories about how her brother used to sneak cookies from the jar, about how he loved drawing superheroes, about how he once told her that she was his real hero. Her voice trembled, but her eyes shone as she remembered him. The billionaire realized he was learning more from this waitress than from any book or boardroom. She was teaching him about courage, patience, and love in ways he had never known. He watched his son, listening to wide-eyed and smiling, as if he felt part of her stories. For the first time, he didn't just see her as the woman who worked at a diner. He saw her as someone who was changing their lives, quietly, not asking for anything in return. That evening, as he walked his son home, the father understood something clearly. This was no longer just about meals at a diner or small acts of kindness. This was a turning point in their lives. The waitress's story had opened his eyes, and now he knew he could never go back to the way things were before. Something had shifted in his heart, something that money could never buy. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew one truth. Because of her, nothing would ever be the same again. Weeks passed, and the billionaire found himself changing in ways he had never expected. His son's laughter, once rare and cautious, had grown frequent and bright. Every evening, the diner became more than a place to eat. It was a sanctuary where the boy could be himself, where the father could learn what it meant to truly care. The waitress, still humble and tireless, continued to show patience and warmth, guiding the boy gently, celebrating every small victory, and making each day feel extraordinary. One Saturday morning, the billionaire decided to take his son out for a walk in the nearby park. Not just for fun, but to enjoy some quiet moments before the diner opened. The waitress joined them, smiling as she balanced the boy's wheelchair over the small, uneven paths. Pointing out flowers and birds as if leading a tiny expedition, the father realized he had never seen his son so engaged, so full of curiosity, outside the controlled walls of home. The boy asked questions about every tree and flower, every squirrel they passed, and she answered him without losing patience. She explained things simply, encouraging him to touch the leaves, smell the flowers, and notice the world around him. For the billionaire, it was a revelation. He had spent years surrounding his son with safety and protection, but he had forgotten the importance of exploration and joy. He watched as the boy giggled when a squirrel scampered by and how the waitress encouraged him to try feeding the ducks with her hand, guiding his small gestures. Every step, every laugh, every word of encouragement reminded him how much he had missed by focusing so much on work and money. Back at the diner, the father became more involved, though quietly. He didn't flaunt his wealth, nor did he treat her as if she needed charity. Instead, he offered small gestures, new supplies for the diner, helping repair a leaky roof, or quietly paying off a few bills she mentioned in passing. But more importantly, he spent time learning how to connect with his son in ways she had shown him through patience, attention, and shared joy. The bond between them grew stronger, but it also began to attract attention. Other diners noticed the billionaire, a man usually reserved and formal, laughing and interacting with his son and the waitress. People whispered behind menus and across tables, curious and sometimes judgmental. Some employees at nearby businesses even began speculating why a man of his status spent so much time with someone so different from his world. But he paid no mind to the gossip. To him, the opinions of strangers meant nothing compared to the warmth of his son's smile and the calm reassurance he saw in the waitress's eyes. Over time, the diner became a hub of unexpected connection. Families started noticing the bond between the boy and the waitress. Children learned that disabilities were not barriers to laughter and fun, and adults realized the power of simple acts of kindness. The billionaire noticed how his presence, while initially intimidating to others, slowly became accepted because of the genuine affection and respect shared among them. Even the waitress seemed to gain more confidence, no longer hiding her exhaustion, instead embracing the role she had taken in their lives. One evening, after a particularly long day, the father observed something he had never seen before. The waitress had guided his son to a small corner of the diner where she had drawn a simple path on a piece of paper. Together, they traced it with a small toy car, turning an ordinary object into a game. The boy was laughing, clapping, and forgetting the limits his body often imposed on him. For the billionaire, it was a moment of clarity. This was the kind of life he wanted for his son. It's filled with attention, creativity, and love. It was not about protection through money, but about freedom through care. As the father reflected on these moments, he began to realize how much he had underestimated the power of someone who genuinely cared. The waitress had no titles, no degrees, no wealth to boast about. Yet she wielded an influence stronger than anything he had ever seen in boardrooms or contracts. Her love and patience were teaching him more than any mentor or teacher ever could. And through her, his son was growing in ways he had never imagined possible. But with growth came challenges. The father noticed that some of his business acquaintances began questioning his choices, suggesting that spending time at a diner with a waitress and his disabled son was beneath him. Invitations to events were sometimes declined or ignored. Whispers followed him in meetings. Initially, he felt a flicker of doubt. For a moment, he wondered if he was making mistakes by allowing his priorities to shift. But then he remembered the boy's laughter, the way his son's face lit up, and the way the waitress had taken his son's small hands into her own and made him feel capable. The doubt vanished. Nothing in the world mattered more than the happiness they were creating together. The father began participating more actively in small ways, learning from the waitress how to nurture his son's confidence. They would spend afternoons reading together. She would help guide his son through small puzzles, and he would watch as the boy learned that effort. Encouragement and patience could make a difference. Even simple conversations became lessons. The boy learned to express feelings, to ask questions, and to trust himself. The billionaire marveled at how the waitress managed all of this without frustration, never pushing too hard, always encouraging just enough. One day, when the diner was quiet, the billionaire asked her why she gave so much of herself without asking for anything. She smiled softly, brushing crumbs off the counter. "Because it's worth it," she said simply. Because even a small moment of care can change someone's whole day or life. The father felt a pang of understanding. He realized that his son's transformation wasn't just about fun or games. It was about feeling seen, feeling safe, feeling valued. And this simple act of recognition was something money could never buy. The weekend trips grew longer. The trio began visiting museums, small theaters, and quiet corners of the city that the father had never explored himself. Each outing was a chance for the boy to experience the world differently, guided by someone who understood his limits and celebrated his curiosity. The waitress encouraged his independence while offering support when needed. The father noticed a balance forming. His son was learning resilience, patience, and joy, and he was learning too. He began to understand the depth of influence a caring person could have in shaping character, confidence, and happiness. Even at home, the father started noticing changes. His son came home talking excitedly about small events, sharing every detail with him. The father began asking questions, listening more attentively, and responding with encouragement rather than just guidance. He realized he had spent years providing material comfort but had neglected emotional connection. The waitress had unwittingly taught him that the best investments weren't stocks or assets. They were moments of attention and understanding. But the real change was in the father himself. For the first time in his life, he felt vulnerable, open to learning from someone not bound by wealth or status. He understood that leadership wasn't always about giving orders. It was sometimes about listening, watching, and allowing growth in those who mattered most. The waitress's quiet influence had rewritten his perspective on life, his family, and what it meant to care. By the end of this period, the trio had become inseparable. The diner, once an ordinary place, now held laughter, love, and trust. The boy had grown in confidence and joy. The father had learned humility and patience. The waitress, though still working long hours and making sacrifices, created a world where small kindnesses had a monumental impact. They had become a family, not bound by blood or wealth, but by care, respect, and shared experiences. And though whispers continued outside, the father no longer noticed. He had found something no fortune could buy, the simple truth that love, patience, and kindness could change everything. For him, his son, and the waitress. Life had entered a new chapter, one filled with connection, trust, and the promise that nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed were filled with small yet extraordinary moments. The billionaire had changed more than he could have imagined, and so had his son. The diner, once a simple stop for breakfast or dinner, had become a place of laughter, learning, and love. The waitress had become the center of this quiet transformation. Her gentle guidance, her patience, and her warmth had taught both father and son lessons that no amount of wealth or privilege could offer. It began with mornings that stretched longer than usual. The father would arrive at the diner with his son. Together they would watch her move from table to table, serving customers with a smile. The boy would ask questions about how she remembered everyone's orders, how she kept so calm when the diner was busy, and how she could be so kind to everyone. She answered with quiet confidence, sometimes laughing, sometimes giving thoughtful answers, and always keeping her focus on the boy in a way that made him feel important. The billionaire observed quietly at first, sipping his coffee, realizing that this woman had a skill far beyond what he had learned in school or business. She could see people, understand them, and respond with care that was natural and genuine. He He thought of all the times he had tried to teach his son lessons through structured activities or expensive toys. Yet none had produced the same light in his son's eyes as these simple moments with the waitress. One afternoon, after the diner had quieted down, the father watched as the boy excitedly ran his fingers over a small puzzle she had brought to the table. She guided him gently, encouraging him to try again when he struggled, never showing impatience. The boy's laughter filled the small space, and the father realized that he had never heard his son laugh like this before. The sound was pure, unguarded. It reached straight into his heart, seeing the bond between the boy and the waitress. The father began to think about his own life and priorities. He had spent decades building wealth, acquiring properties, and attending glamorous events. But he had overlooked the simplest, most meaningful parts of lifetime, attention, and love. He started reflecting on what he truly wanted. Not more business success, not more recognition, but to see his son grow happy, confident, and free. With this realization, he began to act. He asked the waitress how he could help her, not with charity, not with money that would embarrass her, but with practical support. She initially resisted, insisting she could manage on her own, but he quietly offered improvements to the diner, repairing worn tables, installing new lighting, even helping pay for supplies she had struggled to buy. She accepted these gestures with quiet gratitude, never letting them change her warmth or humility. The father also began spending more time at home with his son. Inspired by the waitress, he learned to listen, to respond to small needs, and to celebrate small victories. When his son mastered a puzzle, buttoned his shirt by himself, or shared a story, the father cheered as loudly as the waitress would have. He discovered that encouragement could transform confidence, and that attention could transform character. He started leaving work early, canceling unnecessary meetings, and prioritizing moments that truly mattered. The boy, meanwhile, thrived in this environment. He began trying new things, small adventures outside the diner, trips to the park, and even brief visits to local museums. The waitress guided him gently, always near enough to offer support, but far enough to let him try on his own. The father watched in awe as his son's confidence grew, realizing that he had never known the power of someone's care to change a child's world so completely. Word of the trio's bond began to spread. Other parents noticed the care and attention the waitress gave to children and began to see her as a role model. Even among adults, her influence was clear. She had the ability to soften hearts, to teach patience, and to show the power of kindness. The father noticed it too, realizing that leadership and influence were not always about titles or wealth. They could come from genuine care and understanding. One evening, the father took his son to the diner after a long day at work. The waitress greeted them warmly, as always. The boy had brought a drawing he had made of her, a simple sketch, but to him, it was a masterpiece. He handed it to her with pride. She looked at it carefully, smiling, and then hugged him gently. "This is wonderful," she said softly. "You drew me exactly as I am, and that makes me very happy." The boy beamed, and the father felt a warmth he had never experienced from any business victory. In the weeks that followed, the father realized that his own perspective on life had completely changed. He started investing in programs for children with disabilities, creating opportunities for experiences he wished every child could have. But he didn't do it for publicity or accolades. He did it because he had seen firsthand how one caring person could transform a child's life, and he wanted to multiply that impact. The waitress, now a trusted part of his son's world, was invited to be part of these programs, not as a celebrity figure, not as a token gesture, but as a leader in her own right. Her insights, drawn from real experience and genuine empathy, helped shape initiatives that would bring support and care to many other families. She became a partner in creating opportunities, her humility and wisdom inspiring all who met her. The father watched as his son flourished, confident and happy, no longer shy or withdrawn. The boy often ran to the waitress, sharing stories, laughter, and small victories. He sometimes asked his father questions that showed curiosity and understanding. And the father realized that his son's growth was a result not only of his own attention, but of the nurturing he had received from the waitress. It was a teamwork of love, patience, and kindness. In the quiet moments, the billionaire often reflected on the change He thought about how a single act of kindness in a diner, a small, seemingly ordinary gesture, had rewritten their lives. The waitress had lifted his son into her lap, not knowing the ripple effect it would have. She had given him confidence, joy, and a sense of belonging. She had inspired him, the father, to be present, to care deeply, and to value moments of connection over material wealth. One night, after putting his son to bed, the father sat alone, thinking about the journey they had taken. He realized that nothing in his past achievements could compare to what they had gained together. Love, attention, patience, and empathy had transformed their lives in ways money never could. The waitress had shown them that small gestures, when given with genuine care, could change everything. From that day forward, their lives were never the same. The boy continued to grow in confidence and happiness. The father became more attentive and present, and the waitress continued to guide, teach, and love in her quiet, unassuming way. Together, they had created a new kind of family. One not bound by blood or wealth, but by shared experiences, compassion, and a deep understanding of what truly mattered. The billionaire often reflected that in all his years of business and wealth, he had never witnessed such profound impact from a single human connection. One small act in a diner, simple, kind gesture, had created ripples that changed not just his son's life, but his own. Nothing would ever be the same, and he welcomed the change with an open heart, knowing that true wealth came not from money, but from love, attention, and the courage to care. And so their lives continued, intertwined in a way that no fortune could have planned, filled with laughter, trust, and the quiet, powerful understanding that kindness, patience, and care could rewrite lives forever.